Hey, Modern World History students. So, we are now really wrapping up unit number 8, the Second World War. We have talked in class about the offensives of the Allied powers in Europe, which helped bring an end to Germany's war. And now in section number 15, we'll focus on the Allied offensives in the Pacific, which helped bring an end to Japan's war. So, we're going to be on page 22 up at the top. And you might remember that the original Allied strategy for winning the war, the overall Allied strategy for winning the war, was to beat Germany first. The Allies had identified Germany as the more immediately dangerous, the more immediately threatening of the two enemies, Germany versus Japan. And so, after the United States defeated Japan at the Battle of Midway, and that removed the threat of Japan to invade the west coast of the U.S. Basically, we sort of held the Japanese at arm's length for a year and a half, and we really focused the bulk of our resources on defeating the Germans. Now, once it became clear, say by the summer of 1944, once it became clear that Germany was going to lose the war, I mean, they had not yet lost it, and as a matter of fact, the war against Germany was going to last for another year. But once it became clear that Germany was going to lose the war, the United States and the British, the Allied powers, began to slowly shift resources out to the Pacific to begin the process of defeating Japan. Now, there was really two ideas, two schools of thought on how do you go about doing this. One of those would be to try to recapture all of the islands that the Japanese had conquered, all of the territories that the Japanese had conquered in those first 6 months of the war after Pearl Harbor. But the Allied strategists, the Allied military planners and decision makers concluded that that really wasn't necessary, and that, as a matter of fact, that would be useful or wasteful, both in terms of war materials and the lives of men. And so they came up with a second approach to defeating Japan, in which they said, what we're going to do, instead of trying to recapture every territory that the Japanese took in the first 6 months of the war, we're simply going to focus on those islands, those territories, which are necessary stepping stones toward an invasion of Japan itself. Because they said, look, if we capture Japan itself, then the Japanese government will no longer be able to supply its army, its soldiers, its navy out there on all those islands, and those soldiers will simply run out of supplies and they'll have to surrender. So the idea is, no, we don't have to make an investment in the lives of men and in war materials to try to recapture every territory that the Japanese took. We simply have to focus on those territories, those islands that will lead us step by step and put us in position to invade Japan itself. Once we invade Japan itself and conquer Japan, the rest of the Japanese forces will simply wither on the vine and die out and have to surrender anyway. So this different approach, this second approach to winning the war in the Pacific, became known as island hopping, because the Allied forces, primarily U.S. forces, would hop from island to island, skipping over the ones that weren't necessary and attacking and capturing only the ones that were essential to the ultimate goal of invading and conquering Japan. Now, the number one criterion for deciding which islands would be attacked and which islands would be hopped over, skipped over, was air bases. It was determined that we would bomb Japan. We would engage in many months of strategic bombing of Japan prior to any invasion of Japan. And that strategic bombing, like all strategic bombing, would be designed to destroy the ability of Japan to defend itself, to destroy Japan's capacity to produce war materials and supply its army. And the idea was that after many months of strategic bombing, Japan's defenses would be so worn down that I'm not going to suggest that an invasion of Japan would then be easy, but that it would be possible and that victory would be assured if once we were able to actually begin the process of invading Japan. So the islands that the Allied forces focused on, the islands that the Allies chose to take during this period of island hopping in the spring, summer, fall of 1944 and into 1945, were islands that could be readily converted into air bases. And the Boeing Aircraft Corporation had designed and constructed an airplane that was specifically meant for war in the Pacific. And you see it here, this big four-engine strategic bomber called the B-29. It was known as the B-29 Super Fortress, and it was the largest bomber in the world built at that time, and it had some special capabilities. It had a range of over 3,000 miles. So the B 29 was specifically designed to cover the vast spaces of the Pacific Ocean. It could, it could load up a full load of bombs, fly 3,000 miles, unload its bombs, and then fly back 3,000 miles and land. So it had an operational range of over 3,000 miles, and that was necessary out in the Pacific Ocean where everything is so spread out. Now, the problem with operating over a 3,000-mile range like that is that, at least at the beginning, it would have no fighter protection. It would have no protection from fighters to shoot down enemy fighters. Certainly, the Japanese would put up their own fighter planes, right? The Japanese are going to put fighter planes into the air to try to shoot down the B 29 before it could unload its bombs. And the B 29 would be flying without the protection of Allied fighter planes. So the B-29 had some special capabilities. It was the first airplane ever with a fully pressurized cabin. So you might know, for example, that if you've ever flown in a commercial jet, the cabin has its own air pressure. When you get up at very, very high altitudes, there's not enough air pressure, and air pressure actually plays a big role in helping us to breathe. Air pressure is what helps force the air down into our lungs when we're breathing. And when you get up at very high altitude, there's less air pressure. There's less air pushing down on you. And so it makes it, eventually you get up to a high enough altitude that it makes it so difficult to breathe that human beings can't survive at that altitude. The B-29 was supposed to be able to climb up to that kind of altitude so that it could escape enemy fighter planes. Since it would not have fighter planes protecting it on the way in, it had a pressurized cabin and it had artificial air pressure so that the crew of the B-29 could breathe normally even at very high altitudes. So in order to protect itself, the B-29 could fly up to altitudes that Japanese fighter planes couldn't because they didn't have a pressurized cabin, see? And in that way, it could avoid being attacked and shot down by Japanese fighters. So it was a very large bomber. It carried the largest payload of bombs of any bomber in the world. It had the longest range of any bomber in the world. And it had this special capability of having a pressurized cabin so that it could climb to higher altitudes to avoid being shot down by Japanese fighters. So that was the aircraft that we were thinking about when we began identifying islands to attack and capture and convert into air bases. They were going to be air bases for the B-29 so that we could begin strategic bombing of Japan in anticipation of an invasion. Now, the Japanese certainly sensed that this was what was coming. The Japanese understood that the end game of all of this was an invasion of Japan itself. And as a result of that, the Japanese resistance, the Japanese determination to fight and defend Japan grew more and more intense. So, on all of these islands that the United States and our allies invaded during this island hopping process or this island hopping campaign, um, the Japanese soldiers there fought with tremendous intensity and determination not to surrender. Now, culturally, that's part of the mentality of the Japanese military. In the Japanese military, there is nothing more shameful than to surrender. It is much better to fight to the death and die defending Japan, defending the emperor, than to surrender. And so, there are islands during this island hopping campaign where, maybe there's 22,000 Japanese soldiers defending an island, and U.S. troops invade the island and fight the Japanese, and like 20,000 Japanese are killed, and only 1 or 2,000 of them are taken prisoner. They are determined to fight to the death, and those who are taken prisoner, it's only because they're too badly wounded to keep fighting. So it sort of goes to show you how the intensity of the Japanese in their defense increased. The closer we get to Japan, the more determined the Japanese became to fight to the end. And that really showed itself in the beginnings of what were called kamikaze attacks on Allied ships. Kamikaze in Japan, in Japanese, kamikaze means divine wind. And it actually refers to an incident back in the 1300s when Japan was about to be invaded by the Mongols of China. And there was a huge Mongol invasion fleet making its way across the Sea of Japan to invade and conquer Japan. And a great typhoon, a huge storm blew up and destroyed the entire Mongol invasion fleet. And Japan was saved from invasion. And so this was said to be a gift from God. This storm, which had dispersed the Mongol invasion fleet, was said to be a gift from God. And so it was called kamikaze, divine wind, a wind from God to protect Japan and protect the emperor from invasion. Now, in the closing months of World War II, Japanese fighter pilots began to load their fighters with Japanese naval pilots began to load their planes with bombs and full tanks of gasoline. And they began to intentionally crash their planes into Allied ships. So this was a suicide mission. Kamikaze pilots knew that they were going to die. They were prepared to give up their lives to try to defend Japan and defend the emperor against the Allied invasion forces. So these kamikaze pilots represent another uh, representation of that fanaticism, that determination of the Japanese not to surrender, that they would rather die than surrender. And the Japanese kamikaze pilots considered their lives to be a gift from the god, and that they would give that gift up to defend the emperor and to defend their home from invasion. And there were thousands of kamikaze pilots who died attempting to crash their planes into Allied ships during the last year of the war. I say attempting because it's estimated that only one of every 5 kamikaze pilots actually hit his target. Because, of course, Allied fighter pilots were trying to shoot them down. Gunners on board the ships were trying to shoot them down. And oftentimes they succeeded, and sometimes they simply missed. And so it's estimated that only 1 out of every 5 kamikaze pilots actually hit their target. But there was one battle, the Battle of Okinawa, the naval battle in and around one of these islands, Okinawa, where Allied ships sustained 500 hits from kamikaze pilots. And if only 1 out of 5 actually hit their target, that means there were 2,500 kamikaze pilots who died in that battle. They sank 34 Allied ships. That was the largest loss of Allied shipping of the entire war. Not Pearl Harbor, but the Battle of Okinawa, where the kamikaze pilots destroyed 34 Allied ships. So it was very, very clear as the Allies drew closer and closer to Japan, it was abundantly clear that the Japanese were going to resist with everything they had, that fanatical determination not to surrender, but to fight to the death in defense of the emperor and in defense of Japan itself, was going to make the invasion very, very costly. I'm taking you down to the bottom of page 22 now. So by the spring of 1945, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had died. President Roosevelt died in April of 1945, just a few weeks before the surrender of Germany. So Franklin D. Roosevelt, though he had led the United States through most of the war, did not survive to see the victory over Germany or over Japan. When Roosevelt died, his vice president, Harry Truman, then took over and served as president. And it was therefore Harry Truman who was going to have to oversee the planning for the invasion of Japan. And as I mentioned, um, the information that he was getting throughout those months was that the Japanese soldiers were now resisting with an increasing level of determination. He was the one who was receiving the information of, you know, fighting for an island where there are 22,000 Japanese soldiers and 20,000 are killed and only 2,000 surrender. He was receiving information about some of the islands where the Japanese army had told the civilians living on the island that if they were captured by the Americans would torture them and do horrible things to them, assault them. Kind of the Japanese were kind of saying that the Americans or the Allies would treat civilians really the way that they treated civilians, and so the Japanese were mobilizing civilians on those islands to launch attacks against Allied troops. Allied troops encountered children who were recruited by the Japanese army, trained how to pull the pin on a grenade to make it explode. And some American troops estimated that the children who were walking up to them and pulling the pins on grenades were 9, 10 years old, but their families were told by the Japanese army that if they were captured by the Americans, they would be tortured, and that you'd be better off, dying gloriously in the defense of Japan than to have that happen to you. And so it wasn't just Japanese soldiers who were resisting with increased intensity, but the Japanese army was now recruiting civilians as well to go on these kind of suicide missions, to try and take down a few Allied soldiers one at a time. Back on the home islands of Japan, the civilians were being trained for these sort of suicide militias. They're being trained in hand-to-hand combat and suicide-type combat to defend Japan against the Allied invasion that everybody knew was coming. And so, and of course, Japan also had almost 1 million soldiers still fighting in China. And President Truman was being told, look, if we invade Japan, Japan is certainly going to recall all those soldiers from China to help defend Japan. So when American military planners began to talk about, the possibilities for American casualties in an invasion of Japan, President Truman was being told, look, we can expect that there will probably be, 1 million American casualties in an invasion of Japan. We're probably looking at 1 million American casualties and probably 500,000 of them killed. You have to understand that at that point, 400,000 Americans had already died in the war. And what President Truman was being told was that in an invasion of Japan, an additional 500,000 Americans would be killed and probably another 500,000 injured on top of that. So we're talking about doubling in the invasion of Japan, doubling the number of Americans killed fighting World War II. The United States estimated that probably there would be 2 to 3 million Japanese casualties in an invasion of Japan. 2 to 3 million Japanese, probably most of them killed, soldiers and civilians in total killed. And as it turns out, the Japanese estimated much more than that. The Japanese estimate for casualties, soldiers and civilians, was 10 million. So they really were planning on defending to the last man. So we can understand why President Truman might be looking for some alternative way to end the war, as opposed to going through with the invasion of Japan. And shortly after becoming president, Harry Truman was informed of a top-secret project to build an atomic bomb. This was called the Manhattan Project. So an atomic bomb explodes with the force that is released when atoms are split, okay? So it's called an atomic bomb, right? Atoms are held together by atomic forces, right? The atoms, the basic building blocks of everything, right? They are held together by atomic forces. And when an atom is split, right, when the nucleus of an atom is split apart, all of those forces then are released. And if you take I'm sure you've all seen that famous equation written by Albert Einstein, E equals mc squared, So the E stands for energy, and then the M is the mass of the object, and then c squared is the speed of light multiplied by itself. So what he's saying is, if you have a mass of something, right? You have a mass that can be converted into energy. If you can cause the mass, if you can cause all the atoms in the mass to break apart, then that pure mass can be converted into pure energy. Well, how much energy? Well, if you want to calculate how much energy is released when mass is converted into energy, you multiply that mass by the speed of light, and then you multiply it by the speed of light again. Okay? So that's how much energy is contained. The amount of energy that's used to bond atoms together into a mass is so much that if you convert that mass, if you break those atoms apart and you convert that pure mass into pure energy, an enormous amount of energy is released all at once. And in an atomic bomb, all of that energy then is directed to create a giant explosion, a giant shock that just blasts to smithereens everything in its path. All right? That's how an atomic bomb works. And by the summer of 1945, our scientists, physicists, engineers had completed the atomic bomb, and we had tested it out in the desert of New Mexico. That's the test you see here. And it had exploded with the same force of 20,000 tons of dynamite. So that's 20,000 tons. Remember, a ton is 2,000 pounds. So 20,000 pounds multiplied by 1,000, 20,000, 200,000, 2 million, 20 million. Now multiplied by 2. We're talking about a bomb that exploded with the force of 40 million pounds of dynamite. 20,000 tons. Imagine 40 million pounds, 20,000 tons, 40 million pounds of dynamite all exploding at once. That was the force with which the atomic bomb exploded when we tested it in the New Mexico desert back in the summer of 1945. And so the United States attempted to gain a surrender from the Japanese. But by August of 1945, the Japanese military leaders still refused to surrender, despite threats by the United States that we would begin the process of annihilating Japanese cities. The Japanese military leaders did not believe that the United States had a bomb with the kind of force that the atomic bomb had, and so the Japanese refused to surrender. So I'm taking you to the top of page 23. So on August 6, 1945, with the Japanese still refusing to surrender, the United States used an atomic bomb to destroy the city of Hiroshima. That's the city, or what's left of it, that you see on the left. When the atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima, so the atomic bomb does not detonate when it hits the ground. It detonates about 200 feet above the ground, so that all of that force, if it detonates when it hits the ground, that force, a lot of that force simply goes up into the air, and it's not used against the target. So what this thing is, it's designed so that it detonates about 200 feet above the ground. So all that force instead is directed down at the ground, and then it hits the ground, and then the force works its way outward, creating an enormous blast. So when the first atomic bomb to be used in combat detonated 200 feet above Hiroshima, within the next 2 seconds, 80,000 people died instantly. It killed 80,000 people immediately. Their bodies were vaporized by the blast of light and heat. And basically, as you can see, the entire city was flattened. Those 80,000 who died in those moments after the blast were not the only ones who died, but there were people who were exposed to radiation from the bomb blast. There were people who suffered very severe burns and other injuries and who died in the weeks and months and years that followed as a result of the injuries or as a result of their exposure to radiation, bringing the total number of people killed in the atomic bomb blast at Hiroshima up to probably well over 150,000 people. And still, the Japanese military leaders did not surrender. The Emperor of Japan, Emperor Hirohito, believed that surrender was the best thing to do, but the military leaders told him that they knew the United States only had one such bomb, and so they essentially outvoted the emperor in a way. The military leaders told him, no, it's not time to surrender. And so 3 days later, a second atomic bomb then was dropped by the United States over the Japanese city of Nagasaki. Due to the geography of this city, it didn't kill as many people and it didn't do quite as total damage as the Hiroshima bomb had done, and still 60,000 people were instantly killed when the Nagasaki bomb exploded, with certainly thousands more dying over the following days, weeks, and months due to injury and exposure to radiation. Probably in the end, 300,000 people, Japanese civilians, died as a result of the two atomic bomb explosions. After the second atomic bomb was dropped, at that point, Emperor Hirohito was in a much stronger position. His military leaders had clearly failed him. Number one, they had given him incorrect information about the atomic bomb. And more importantly, they had led Japan into a war which Japan now clearly was going to lose at great cost to the Japanese people. And so Emperor Hirohito's position was now much stronger relative to the military leaders. They had shamed themselves. And now the emperor asserted himself. After the second atomic bomb was dropped, Emperor Hirohito, for the first time, really asserted himself against the military leaders and demanded that Japan surrender. So Japan's surrender was announced by the emperor a few days later in a radio broadcast to the Japanese people, telling them that the Allied forces would soon be landing in Japan to occupy Japan. He encouraged the Japanese people not to resist. In the wake of these decisions, many of Japan's military leaders committed suicide. And on September 2nd, 1945, on board the decks of the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Harbor, the Japanese military and civilian leaders officially surrendered. So September 2nd, 1945 is known as VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, in the Allied countries. And of course, it then meant the end of World War II. And you can see the celebrations in Times Square, New York City there, when the news of Japan's surrender reached New York and reached the United States. So that brings an end to the Second World War. It was won at enormous cost in life, particularly to the people of the Soviet Union and China, but to the people of Britain and the United States and Canada and France as well. We'll talk more about that. And of course, there was so much loss of life during the Holocaust, and in future lessons, we'll discuss the Holocaust. Until then, please take care of yourselves. Stay happy, stay safe. So long, world history students.